excited, though, to be shooting video. And a video we shot and posted up to YouTube last week was our breakdown of Bob Iger's book. Bob Iger has written, his memoirs have been recently published, and we picked up a copy last week. Couldn't wait to dive into it. And Mr. Iger spills a lot of beans in his new book, and we were walking you through it last week, but we ran out of time before we got to some real juicy stuff. So this week we're going to pick up where we left off last week, and if you can't remember where we left off last week, we have a little anonymous voicemail message here that will get you up to speed, sort of in the tradition of individual episodes of Star Wars: The Clone Wars. You would have Tom Kane as the narrator, get you up to speed with what's happening. So let's turn it over to the RFR voicemail hotline and get ourselves up to speed.
When we last left our hero, George Lucas had just received word that his beloved project had been compromised. During a meeting between Kathleen Kennedy, J.J. Abrams, and Michael Arndt, George had discovered what he feared most. His scripts were no longer more, and a newer yet strangely the same, basically the same plot point from his original film had secretly snuck into the treatment for Episode 7. Storming out of his office, George had but one option: to call the legendary Charlie Rose to make sure his story and the fate of his galaxy was given the proper treatment and justification. We now join our storytellers, Jason and Jimmy, as they try and deconstruct this alarming chain of events.
Oh, man, I love that. Clone Wars style. That's awesome.
So thank you to the RFR narrator, whoever you may be out there in RFR voicemail land. You guys are nuts, and you continue to leave us voicemails at 708-320-1RFR. That always crack us up. And even if you don't make it to the airwaves, we're listening to everything you guys leave for us. So let's jump back into it.
Yeah.
We're going to get into the ride of a lifetime, lessons learned from 15 years as CEO of the Walt Disney Company by Mr. Robert Iger. And specifically, we're looking at Chapter 11, Star Wars. And we have some audiobook highlights here for you, not done in the voice of Bob Iger, but in the voice of narrator Jim Frangione. And this is, of course, available now at audible.com/RFR for your listening pleasure. And I strongly suggest you listen to this book. It's very compelling.
It is.
And it just presents a whole different world of business that I'll never be able to relate to, quite honestly. I mean,
yeah, and for you Marvel fans, there's a ton in it about the Marvel acquisition as well. Pixar. I mean, you talk about media moguls, Jim. I mean, just the fact that you've got guys like George Lucas, Steve Jobs from Apple, and Bob Iger, all kind of swimming in the same seas together, and what a crazy connection between the three of them with Pixar, and the fact that he would acquire all of them, and then Marvel in the meantime. It's just an amazing story. But what I keep coming back to, and I was talking to our pal Max Sparky about this over the weekend as well, is something that you pointed out, is that the way that Bob Iger, the cloth that he is cut from, and I'm not saying this to denigrate his character at all. There's all different types of folks, but there is a corporate coldness with how he recounts these things. And George is many things, but George is not, and I don't think has ever been a real or comfortable with the whole corporate scene. George has always been a bit of a rebel, despite his kind of outwardly sort of square conservative vibe that he sort of gives off in some ways, but certainly not a corporate guy. And it's very interesting to hear this whole tale told in such a cold way. And that's the best way I can describe it. And you yourself described it that way as well.
Yeah, and that's what I mean when I say this is a world that I could never really relate to, because I would probably just end up curled up in a ball in the corner, just weeping every day. What's he doing in his office all the time? So last week we presented you Bob Iger's take on how everything went down with Disney's acquisition of Star Wars, from how he pitched the sale to George Lucas, how he realized George Lucas wanted to retain some sort of creative control of Star Wars, and the struggle between Iger and Lucas to negotiate how that would all go down. George revealed he had story treatments for Star Wars, which I believe were written as a reaction to the negotiations that were taking place.
Specifically, the valuation that was given to Lucasfilm. He needed something to sweeten the deal.
George's priority leading up into and during the year 2011, when all of these negotiations really started to find their foundation, George was concerned with a live-action TV series, a Star Wars TV series that he wanted to produce, but couldn't find a cheap way to do that. And so he was actually trying to build his own studio to facilitate a Star Wars television show. And then possibly, depending on how that all went down, opening himself up to the idea of creating new Star Wars films. But that wasn't really George's priority, the films. I think he was more interested in television until Iger revealed to George, well, hey, it's great you got these TV shows you're working on, but what we need is movies. We need cinema. Maybe Iger would be whistling a different tune once he started to develop Disney Plus, the streaming service.
Yeah, as you were saying that, Jim, I was just thinking, George has always been one of those guys that could see around corners. And, he was a big fan of shows like Deadwood and The Sopranos and some of the very cutting-edge material that HBO was doing that would then pave the way for the Netflix and the Amazon Primes to do what they're doing. So I think George saw the rich storytelling that was happening on television or on the small screen, and that's why he was so motivated by that and focused on that. But, you're right, because we forget sometimes about he also had a deal go south there in California, not just for the museum, but also for the sound stages and the facilities he was trying to build there.
Right. Exactly. And that was his priority until he started really getting down and dirty with negotiating Star Wars and selling it to Disney. So Iger recalled all of that. He recalled the day Disney bought Lucasfilm, Kathy Kennedy surprise hire, and the mistake that Iger eventually realized he made by not telling George that his story treatments were being cast aside for a new and different direction. He let that happen in a meeting that went down between JJ, Kathy Kennedy, and George Lucas at Skywalker Ranch. And George was blindsided by that news. He was blindsided.
He had no idea. No one had thought to give him a call and say, Bob Iger could have easily called him and said, hey, George, before you have this meeting, I just want to let you know it might not be what you're thinking. We did decide to go a different direction in terms of the story beats and all of that. That didn't happen.
It didn't happen. And George was blindsided. He was insulted and felt betrayed and walked away from Star Wars for at least the production of The Force Awakens. And so now we catch up with our story here with Bob Iger and his book. And he recounts how George eventually, the moment George sat down to watch The Force Awakens and what George's response to all of that was.
Just prior to the global release, Kathy screened The Force Awakens for George. He didn't hide his disappointment. There's nothing new, he said. In each of the films in the original trilogy, it was important to him to present new worlds, new stories, new characters, and new technologies. In this one, he said, there weren't enough visual or technical leaps forward. He wasn't wrong, but he also wasn't appreciating the pressure we were under to give ardent fans a film that felt quintessentially Star Wars. We'd intentionally created a world that was visually and tonally connected to the earlier films. to not stray too far from what people loved and expected. And George was criticizing us for the very thing we were trying to do. Looking back with the perspective of several years and a few more Star Wars films, I believe J.J. achieved the near impossible, creating a perfect bridge between what had been and what was to come.
Wow, in that particular sense, I both agree and disagree with Bob Iger. I am still extraordinarily fond of The Force Awakens. I think J.J. did do a masterful job. I think J.J. was very upfront about what he believed was the need to create familiarity, and then throughout the process of the storytelling, start to turn it into a different direction. So I'm with Bob on that. I think J.J. did an incredible job with The Force Awakens, and for all those reasons. However, I also see George's point of view. George was always, if you look at all of the Star Wars films from 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, every one is in many ways a leap year beyond the one before it in terms of technology, in terms of just the storytelling in and of itself. George was constantly using his films as ways to advance the medium, advance the art. And he was essentially seeing what I think he saw in Episode 7 was a tribute album.
Yeah. And that's what it felt like. And they made a big deal about it, how they were going to use practical effects and make it a story that felt like it was very connected to the original trilogy. And that's what fans wanted. A few weeks ago on the show, I was bemoaning the fact that a lot of the concept of fan service gets hated on by a lot of people. And George Lucas definitely included in that. I was saying, what's wrong with fan service? Fan service is oftentimes pretty smart. I see a lot of that happening with the Marvel universe that everyone loves so much. What's wrong with fan service? So George was saying the same thing, but I just think he was thinking more in terms of, you're giving me another Death Star. You're giving me another desert planet. You're giving me another orphan who is finding themselves in Force. You're giving me another situation where the droid delivers the plans, or in this case, the map. There was a lot of retread stuff going on there. And when I say I want fan service, I don't want a retelling of a story I've already heard with a new layer of paint on it. That's not what I mean when I'm talking about fan service. And I think that's been a big criticism of J.J. Abrams' The Force Awakens, is the fact that it does feel like the same story we've already heard with a different coat of paint on it. It didn't. I thought it was important to establish a brand new launching pad for Star Wars and base it in familiarity. And I've been saying that forever. And I think JJ did a great job doing that. But to a guy like George Lucas, George sees retread all over the place. And doesn't feel like it did anything to expand the story. As a matter of fact, it kind of sets the story back a little bit by repeating a lot of the similar beats and rhythm of the original film. And so George doesn't like that, but he's obviously going to be super critical of it because they didn't use his treatment, which he would feel to be superior to anything they're going to show him. I mean, they could show him Empire Strikes Back, for crying out loud.
That's extraordinarily important to point out, because what is he comparing it to? We don't have really anything to compare it to, and we say, "Wow, I wish they'd have gone another way." George had his own ideas that were George Lucas's sequels to George Lucas's films, and he's like, why are you making this so difficult? I gave you the blueprint right here. These are my sequels.
Yeah, and so, to hear Iger then say George didn't appreciate the pressure we were under, that to me reeks of a lot of arrogance on Bob Iger's part. To say that about George Lucas, that he doesn't understand the pressure.
Yeah.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
So,
after the prequels, you don't think George understood the pressure?
So Bob believes that the way that they took was right and just, and the only way to do it to make people happy. Mm-hmm. But for a guy like Bob Iger to say George Lucas doesn't appreciate the pressure that someone's under when they're making a Star Wars film, that kind of pisses me off a little bit. You know, that pisses me off to hear that.
I also think that George would have really found, I like to think that George would have found a really strong ally to bring his vision of the sequels into being with J.J. Abrams. I can't think of someone that would be more suited to work with a guy like George Lucas, but I'm not working with J.J. I don't know, but
I think George wanted Ron Howard in that seat.
Could be.
I'll be honest with you. I think George Lucas wanted Ron Howard. He had made a statement about that. Ron Howard was kind of reiterating what George said. Mm-hmm. He was talking about calling George to say, hey, I'm going to work on this solo film. And George said to Ron, you're the guy I told them they should have hired in the first place.
I didn't hear that.
Look it up.
Interesting. I don't doubt you. But I hadn't heard that. Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing. He didn't say that. That's not an exact quote, but
sure.
He indicated very clearly that he thought Ron was the guy. So naturally, when things go belly up with Lord and Miller, the first call they make is to Ron.
Fancy that.
But like I said, you know what? They could have put up there something like Marvel Endgame, but just based in the Star Wars universe and have it have that kind of impact. And George still would have hated it. There would be nothing they could have put up on that screen that George would have liked. But
as long as it wasn't his.
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. I really, really believe that because he was rejected. He was cast aside. And
can you let's just hold on. Let's just back up for a second. Imagine this. Okay. Imagine this. George Lucas, his ideas for a sequel trilogy, episode 7, 8, 9, were rejected. George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars. Go back in your time machine to 2009, 2010, and imagine a world where George Lucas's ideas for episode 7, 8, 9 would be rejected by another movie studio.
By the guy, well, okay, I don't want to put I was going to say something, but I don't want to jump to that conclusion quite yet, because up till now, I've been sort of presenting this narrative that it was Bob Iger. Bob was the one who rejected George's story treatment. Bob Iger was the one who never had any motive to work with George Lucas from the moment the sale had become a tantalizing thing for Bob, something that he could actually acquire. Mm-hmm. I don't know. We'll get to that in a few minutes.
All right.
All right. But we know that George isn't going to like whatever is presented to him because he's been rejected. And Bob Iger's no fool. He recognizes this too. So he wants to work out a little agreement with George, some paperwork for George to sign. And they really think it's important to get George Lucas to the premiere of The Force Awakens so they can put on a good show for everyone. Yeah. Because if George didn't show up to that premiere, everyone would have been asking. Yep. And it would have come out before the film was even released that George doesn't like it. And that sort of publicity blowback would be really hard for Disney to tap dance around.
Well, everybody was waiting to hear what George Lucas thought of the new Star Wars movie. That was going to be the headline.
And he said, the fans are going to like it. It's not the movie I would have made. So Iger has some paperwork for George, and they're dying to get him at the premiere to save face. So in cut 8
here we go.
Even though he had issues with the film, I thought it was important for George to be at the Force Awakens premiere.
So we look good.
He didn't want to come at first, but Kathy, with the help of George's now wife, Melody Hobson, convinced him it was the right thing to do. Among the last things we negotiated before the deal closed was a non-disparagement clause. I asked George to agree that he wouldn't publicly criticize any of the Star Wars films we made. When I brought it up with him, he said, "I'm going to be a big shareholder of the Walt Disney Company. Why would I disparage you or anything you do? You have to trust me." I took him at his word.
George, he's not going to sign off on that thing. Don't put that non-disparagement clause in front of George Lucas. I mean, you're lucky he didn't get completely insulted and pull the whole come on. So, all right. How many of these? How many minutes
have you
of
clocked?
Star Wars podcasting have you done? And that, all right.
That's a first. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a first. I'm so glad I was here to witness.
But George could have taken his ball and gone home, is what I was trying to say. But
yes,
but Iger recognized that too. So he's all right. George says he's not going to bash the film. He's not going to bash the film.
Mm-hmm.
But as we heard in our intro from the voicemail, when we last left our heroes, George had one call to make, and that was to Charlie Rose. And so George went on. What is Charlie? Was it a 60 minutes?
It was
thing?
60 minutes at that time. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Before Charlie got bounced from that for questionable activities. But
he wanted to know what those boxer shorts looked like, so he called his assistant in.
All right. And George Lucas walked in wearing boxer shorts.
Oh, there's an image.
And ready to talk. So if you've been wondering what Bob Iger thinks about George Lucas and his discussion with Charlie Rose when he revealed that he believes he sold Star Wars to the white traders that slavers or traders, slavers, whatever. But so here's Iger talking about the Charlie Rose.
The movie opened and set a slew of box office records, and we all breathed a sigh of relief. Our first Star Wars film was behind us, and the Star Wars faithful appeared to have loved it. Shortly after the release, though, an interview George had done a few weeks earlier with Charlie Rose aired. George talked about his frustration that we hadn't followed his outlines and said that selling to Disney was like selling his children to white slavers. It was an unfortunate and awkward way for him to describe the feeling of having sold something that he considered his children. I decided to stay quiet and let it pass. There was nothing to be gained from engaging in any public discourse or waging a defense. Melody sent me an apologetic email, explaining how difficult this had all been for him. Then George called me. "I was out of line," he said. "I shouldn't have said it like that. I was trying to explain how hard it is to let this thing go." I told him I understood.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So Melody, she immediately responds and writes back Iger right away, apologizing, because Melody works in that realm, that corporate realm with the big money and stuff. So when they want Lucas to go to the premiere, they use her as leverage
Right.
and get her in there. Because they can talk to corporate talk to her and get through to her.
The big picture. That's what they like to say, the big picture.
Now, ethically speaking, to be using the guy's wife to get him to make decisions, that to me kind of comes off as a crummy deal. But Melody obviously is very involved in George and his business, working in the realm of high finance that she exists in. So she probably got all over George and said, "You are going to send Bob Iger an email apologizing for this." But come on, Melody, white slaver. I said white slaver.
The layers of all of this. First of all, he's drawing on extremely, he's drawing on this metaphor that is just steeped in race and and he's married to Melody. I mean, the layers on all of this is just crazy. I can imagine her reaction to that as a black woman, as a wife, as a corporate, employee or sympathetic.
Damage control is all she's saying.
Absolutely,
damage control.
Absolutely, on so many layers. It was a terribly irresponsible thing for George to say.
Yes.
For a guy that has been so guarded over these years and been reclusive in lots of ways, to come out and say something like that, it was not a good moment for George. That's for sure.
And the timing was terrible, of course,
Yes.
with The Force Awakens in theaters and
people loving it.
People going crazy for it, and it being the hugest box office success on American soil up until the last Avengers movie. So, so I hear this stuff, and I'm always like Team George, and I feel his pain, and I look at Bob Iger as the big bad guy. And so last week on the show, I was saying it was Bob Iger who betrayed George, and all of this stuff. And I mean, Bob has to take that responsibility. But was it Bob Iger's call ultimately, or Bob Iger, being involved in the art of negotiation, had to throw away George's treatment because he wanted something?
Mm-hmm.
And the thing he wanted, I think, was J.J. Abrams. And I think accommodations were made along the way. And to sort of put these dots together and figure out what happened, we have created a timeline of events. This breaks down the sale of Star Wars to Disney chronologically. And I've been putting this timeline together for the last couple of weeks. After our show last week, I was reached out to by RFR loyal listener Matt Bell, who presented me with some additional evidence to add to the timeline. And he's been a great help in assisting me as I try to piece all this stuff together. And so here we go. Let's just jump right in. According to the Bob Iger book, the very first mention of Star Wars being sold to Disney, of Disney trying to acquire Star Wars, the very first time this was mentioned outside of Bob's office was when he sat down with George Lucas on the morning Star Tours 2, The Adventures Continue debuted in May 2011. May 2011, Star Tours, the revamped Star Tours debuts. George and Iger have breakfast, and Iger plants the seed.
Jim, when the announcement was made and everything went down, I had assumed that George sought Disney out. It really wasn't until this book that I realized that Iger, in fact, even confiding in Steve Jobs before he died, when Jobs said, "Well, what's next? What are you looking at?" And he said, "I'm looking at Star Wars." Mm-hmm. That was news to me, that Iger had his sights set on Lucasfilm. I had assumed the other way.
It was Iger who actually was the first to bring it up. Mm-hmm. And that was revealed in that Bloomberg article from 2013. That was our best look into everything that went down before Iger's book.
Right.
So it was Iger who mentioned it. Then in November 2011, after having been given initial approval to go ahead with his Grady Ranch studio, George Lucas received a letter from a special interest group representing local residents in the city of Marin. And they told him they are going to proceed with a challenge to his. They were going to put the pressure on him to not build the studio. They were afraid of the infrastructure of the area being severely under pressure and the traffic and all the problems that it would cause. You have to understand, in this area where George Lucas has built Skywalker Ranch and Big Rock Ranch and where he wanted to build Grady Ranch, it is out in the country. I mean, it's in the hills. It's single winding, road that takes you there, single lane road that takes you there. It can't handle the stresses of rush hour traffic and things like that, more than it already has to deal with.
Now, keep in mind, though, this Grady Ranch studio was going to be where this Star Wars, what was it, Underworlds TV series was going to be filmed.
Right.
And, so this was going to be the new home of production in terms of Star Wars.
That's right. And I think George was using that sort of as a, maybe he could make a Star Wars movie from his own studio if he wanted to. It would have remained to have been seen, but he would definitely want to go through with that television show. He was struggling with the cost, so he decided to put it all under his roof and build a studio.
Right.
Well, that got shut down November 2011. 6 months after he had that sit down with Iger. Mm-hmm. So that has to be, he can't win. He can't build the studio. He can't do his TV show. He can't afford to do the TV show, but he wants to keep doing Star Wars. So what's he going to do? Well, he calls Iger right around the holidays, December 2011, and gives him a call, and they start talking. And over the next few weeks, the talks got to the point where George felt comfortable announcing publicly his retirement. And he did it January 2012 in a New York Times interview while he was out promoting Red Tails. And so now George is announcing he's retiring. He's actively talking to Disney about selling Star Wars. And according to Bob Iger's book, they reached a purchase price agreement pretty quickly. But it was all the minutia involved in the deal, about George's involvement, about probably pieces of property, who knows, that had to be hammered out. So even though they agreed to the sale price and to go through with the sale, there was still a lot of minutia that had to be gone through. So George is feeling comfortable
like selling
now.
a house. You agree on the price, and then the inspections happen after that.
Right.
Yeah.
So George starts priming Star Wars fans and the public for the fact that he is going to be stepping down, which seems kind of weird for a guy who wants to still be involved, but that was, that's what he said. He wasn't going to make any more Star Wars. As a matter of fact, TMZ caught up with him in March 2012, and we have audio of that. This is the first time George is actually caught out in public saying that he is retired.
You're going to pass on a trip.
Sorry. Here it is.
Mr. Lucas, how you doing today? Mr. Lucas, how you doing today? Good. Everybody's wondering when the newest installments for Star Wars is going to be. Never. 7, 8, and 9. Never? Harrison, Mark.
I'm retired. What do you mean you're
Harrison,
retired?
Mark,
We love you.
Harrison, Mark, and Carrie are all the right age.
Billion is still small.
George couldn't get in his car and get away from those goons fast enough.
But you know what? That's the first time we played this back when it actually happened. And how prolific were these guys? Saying, hey, Harrison, Mark, and Carrie, they're all wanting to get back together. Nobody was really talking about that.
Yeah, what's up with that? That seems a little fishy to me, quite honestly. It feels like a setup, actually. Here these guys are.
Something?
And George, and this is right about the time George is realizing, well, geez, Iger is going to buy it, but I need to put some more value behind it and, get some stuff going here. And that way I can slide in on the sale and stay involved in Star Wars. So right about this time, I think George is starting to actively work on ideas for the sequel trilogy because he was informed by Iger.
Yeah.
We're not going to, because George wanted the Pixar price.
Right.
And Iger said, no way are we giving that to you because they had 6 films in development when we purchased them.
And they had a whole team of writers.
Yeah.
And content creators, very talented people.
You're one guy with 50 scripts to a TV show you can't even make. And we're not really interested in the TV show. We want to make movies.
Boy, so we knew that they weren't interested in that TV show that he wanted to make and also the TV show that he was in the process of making, the Clone Wars.
Right. They didn't want anything to do with Clone Wars because Clone Wars had too strong a connection to the prequel trilogy. Right. And the Disney guys did not want to deal with the prequels.
Yep.
They thought that the prequels were bad news.
Yep.
And it took them a long time to realize that there's real value. Thank you, Netflix, for putting the Clone Wars out there. And that helped us get the season 6 released. Mm-hmm. And people ate that up. And, Disney realized that there is value in prequel era Star Wars storytelling, but they did not feel that way in 2012 when they were negotiating with George. The first thing they wanted to do once they got the keys to Lucasfilm was shut down the Clone Wars, close down essentially Lucas Animation and LucasArts.
Yeah, and I remember those days because we had pretty good sources letting us know that the future of the Clone Wars was in jeopardy. Jim, you started the hashtag Save the Clone Wars campaign on social media, and you were accused of being, a henny penny sky is falling. People said, "Oh, Jimmy Mack, you're crazy. What's going?" But there was reality to it. We knew what was going down.
Chicken Little, they called me.
Yes.
And I was actually getting my information directly from Clone Wars cast and crew. And they were more than anxious for me to get out there and start spreading the word that Clone Wars demise was a lot sooner than fans thought it was going to be. So that's when we invented hashtag Save the Clone Wars. That all started right here on Rebel Force Radio. Okay, so let's get back to our time.
Yes.
Retired. So meanwhile, he's anything but retired. He is out there. He's out talking to Kathleen Kennedy about coming on board with his company. He's starting to develop ideas with writers, and when the writers come on board, that's a little bit of a gray area for me because I have the feeling George was working on stuff. By summer of 2012, George was definitely working because Pablo Hidalgo revealed that he found out that 7, 8, and 9 were coming in the summer of 2012.
Can we just back up a second, though? You kind of glossed over the Kathleen Kennedy thing. And
yes.
And what I wanted to point out there was, and Iger talks about this in his book, George hired Kathleen and did not fill her in that he was in negotiations, in talks with selling the company to Disney.
Right.
He also didn't let Bob Iger know that he was hiring in a new CEO.
Right.
And it was almost like Kathleen was sort of this Trojan horse so that George might be able to maintain a certain level of control of the company through Kathleen because George made it clear he didn't want to be an employee. So what could he do? He could hire Kathleen Kennedy, who would be an employee of Disney, but also someone that George could have on the bat phone and, perhaps, I don't want to say manipulate, that's not the right word, but exert a certain amount of control or influence. Let's say influence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Kathy gets brought on board, and she clearly knows that 7, 8, and 9 are coming. And when Kathleen Kennedy was brought on board, a source told me there is no way she's going to Lucasfilm unless they're going to start making new Star Wars films. That's what I heard initially. I never heard 7, 8, and 9 right out of the box. I didn't hear about that for a little while longer. But when Kathy was brought on board, I was told smart money means Star Wars is going back into the theaters.
Why have Kathleen Kennedy there if that wasn't the case? She's not going to oversee season 7 of the Clone Wars.
No. July 2012, also the same month, Kathleen Kennedy, it's revealed publicly that she was hired as co-chair of Lucasfilm. George gets caught by TMZ once again.
I gotta ask, the pictures leaked of the new Star Wars. I mean, I'm retired. Are you bored of retired yet? Are you bored yet? You know? I'm really happy. Do you still get creative thoughts? Like, it's like you just want to get back into it all? I hear you, man. Well, good seeing you, bud.
Those TMZ guys. You got to have such thick skin, man.
Do you still get creative thoughts?
Can you get thoughts?
George is like, get me out of here.
Are you ever in the shower, George, and you got a really good idea, but you're all wet, you can't write it down? These guys.
What pictures they were talking about back then.
Lucas.
Why is that replaying? I don't know. Anyway.
But, okay, so, meanwhile.
Yes.
Pablo Hidalgo revealed, and he revealed this after the Disney sale was made official, but he kind of helps us with this timeline a little bit himself when he says June 29th, 2012, he was called into a meeting and he was told, we're making 7, 8, and 9. And that's when, because like everyone was, when Kathleen Kennedy came on board at Lucasfilm, she started asking people who around here knows the most about Star Wars, other than George Lucas, of course. Who knows the most about Star Wars? And a lot of people pointed in the direction of Pablo Hidalgo. And Pablo was doing stuff with the Clone Wars show at that time, I believe. I don't really know what his role was on that show. He was formerly working on StarWars.com, but he had shifted into some sort of different position, and he was working on
something.
Yeah, something.
Creative executive, I think, was his title.
Right. So he says, in short order, I met with some of Kathleen Kennedy's key staffers who are now aboard with Lucasfilm, meaning Kathleen Kennedy brought along her own people. He introduced himself. I introduced myself to her expanding story development team and offered what insight I could given my long history with Star Wars and my deep knowledge of the saga. He says, okay, as George Lucas began preparing his treatments for future films, I'd get random requests for research from his office and help prepare documents, primers, and writer's guides for the next generation of Star Wars filmmakers, whoever they may be. So that's summer 2012. George is hard at work now on these story treatments.
Yep.
So let me jump back here to the timeline. Later that summer, August 2012, George met with Mark and Carrie at Star Wars Celebration 6 and told them he is making new Star Wars films. Would they be on board with that?
Now, Jim, we were on the ground at Star Wars Celebration 6. We saw the caravan of black armored vehicles that brought George and Carrie and Mark into the convention center there, and rumors were rampant that they had all gone out for a meal together. And you and I remember us standing there saying, what would possibly bring them together for a meal? And we started to speculate.
We did.
We did. And this is before any knowledge of anything Disney was concerned.
Not long after, the next month in September 2012, Kathleen Kennedy announced to Lucasfilm employees that new films were on the way. And my phone rang shortly after that meeting broke, and people told me 7, 8, and 9 are coming. I still think I was only hearing new films at that time. I didn't think I was hearing 7, 8, 9. But we did know new Star Wars were definitely coming, and that Lucasfilm knew about it. And that was in September 2012. Jump to October 2012, shortly before the sale was announced. Remember, the sale to Disney was announced on October 30th, 2012. During that month, that was a busy month. That's when they brought along Lawrence Kasdan. He was invited to Skywalker Ranch to meet with George. So October 2012, George and Kasdan, they're sitting down, they're talking with Kathleen Kennedy, and they start to determine what direction the films are going to go in. And this is all from a lot of this information I'm giving you is from the making of The Force Awakens and the making of The Last Jedi. That's where the bulk of what I'm going to tell you is coming from. Kasdan is quoted as saying, this one actually is from the New York Times or the LA Times. He says, Kasdan says, I went up and George had sort of roughed out many movies, not just the new trilogy, but other movies, the spin-offs and things. I wasn't really sure I wanted to do anything, but I said I could do the Han Solo movie because he's my favorite character. So Lucas had roughed out not just the new trilogy, but other movies, spin-offs. And I think that was more of a blue sky creative period for George, where he was going up to the whiteboard and saying, well, who else can we make movies out of? We can make a Boba Fett movie. And he wrote that up there. And the Boba Fett movie, the first time I ever heard anyone talk about it was Joe Johnston, who appeared on Kevin Smith's podcast in 2011. And he said he would like to make a Boba Fett movie. So
that was kind of out of the blue.
Yeah, that was totally out of the blue. Yeah, yeah. That was just way out of the blue. But maybe Joe was privy to some information.
Right.
That seems a little early, though, 2011. Because the idea of George actually starting to nurture new Star Wars stories for films really started happening in 2012. Obviously, because he wanted to add value to his company before he sold it to Disney. And he wanted to slide in a creative position to continue working on Star Wars without having all the pressures of owning Star Wars. So late October 2012, sale to Disney is announced. And in December of that year, 2012, Rick Carter, who is the art director on both The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker, and someone who's been tight with Kathleen Kennedy because they worked on the Jurassic Park film back in 1993. So Rick Carter is one of Kathleen Kennedy's guys. Doug Chiang, who we know is a concept artist from the prequels, and David Nakabayashi, who is then creative director of ILM. He might still be, I don't know. I'm not familiar with David. But they all met together at LDAC at Presidio, Lucasfilm headquarters. They met on December 11th, 2012 to handpick a dream team of designers for the Episode 7 art team. And the next day, December 12th, Rick Carter met with George Lucas at the main house at Skywalker Ranch. So they're talking now.
Now, this is incredible. This is 2 months after the sale.
That's right.
George is meeting with a creative team of designers.
That's right.
Wow.
So following his meetings,
2 months,
and following his meetings with Lawrence Kasdan, George is now meeting with Rick Carter, Doug Chiang, and the creative director at ILM. So it sure seems like post-sale, George was still very involved, which then puts a wrinkle in my whole concept that Bob Iger was the one who threw away George's scripts, because obviously in these early days, George is working on Star Wars. And why are they meeting with him? Why is an art team meeting with George Lucas to talk about Star Wars? Because obviously everyone's looking at his treatments and thinking to themselves, this is the next Star Wars. And I think Bob Iger is one of those people who was on board with that. So
yes,
for us to continue to throw Bob Iger under the bus, even though in his book he does make it very clear that he did not want George Lucas to be in a position of creative leadership as Star Wars moves into the future under the Disney umbrella.
And that's exactly what appears to be happening here in December 2012.
No, it appears that, yes. I mean, if you mean it appears George is actually working on this stuff, I think Iger was giving him a shot.
Well, but I think it seems like I can't imagine Carter and Chang and Nakabayashi all convening around George and not treating George as the de facto leader.
Yes, exactly. So why are these meetings happening?
Yeah.
Kathleen Kennedy is probably very responsible for making these meetings happen, because I think the original plan was to go with George's treatments. January 2013, after the holidays, J.J. Abrams is brought on board. Finally, they got the director now.
Yep.
They've been asking people for months, and J.J. initially turned him down. Now he's brought on board. So January 9th, Rick Carter, again, the art director for The Force Awakens, and one of Kathleen's guys, who was one of the earliest guys to be working on Episode 7, was Rick Carter. He called a meeting of the concept art department with Michael Arndt, George's guy, Michael Arndt, Lucasfilm Vice President of Development Kiri Hart, and soon to be meaning soon to be announced, director J.J. Abrams. So they're meeting with J.J. as early as January 9th, 2013. Even though, you know, they've had meetings with George, but now they're meeting with J.J. Okay. Now, here is the meeting with George Lucas where they dropped the bomb on him. Possibly. They all met January 16th, 2013, with George at Skywalker Ranch. Among the pieces presented at the ranch's main house were additional portraits of Luke, the temple where he dwelled in exile, and the training of a young disciple, Kira, later named Rey.
You know,
okay.
As late as Star Wars Celebration, we saw Rey still referred to as Kira in some of the props and the pieces that were out there.
But that was after The Force Awakens came out. And I think it just said that. I don't know why.
No, that was before The Force Awakens came out. That was before. That was the summer before the movie actually came out. And it was Kira's speeder that was on display there, not Rey's speeder that was on display. So there was an interchanging of those names, the Kira and Rey. Yes, because we met the BB-8 creators.
Yeah, but I mean,
that was before the film.
That was before the film.
Yes.
But Star Wars Celebration 2015.
Right.
Yeah, why did they say it was Kira's speeder? I don't know why. I mean, that just is confusing. But
no, it is. But I mean, that just goes to show you that the character's name kept going back and forth, I think, between Kira and Rey.
So this meeting, though.
Kira, by the way, is a name I believe that emanated from George's treatment.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And that Kira stuff is all in the Force Awakens Art of book, the Art of Force Awakens book. Right. So, I mean, it's no big secret. Right. But this January 16th, 2013 meeting with George Lucas at Skywalker Ranch. This is what we believe to be the meeting where George realized they were not using his concepts. Because we cannot find any other mention of Lucas' involvement in the films after this date, January 16th, 2013. That's when it all hit the fan, I think.
That's it.
February 2013, The Force Awakens and 2 new spin-off films were announced. One would be authored by screenwriter producer Simon Kinberg, the Boba Fett film, which was then scrapped. The other would be the Han Solo film. Okay, I guess, or it could have been Rogue One. Yeah, but see, that comes from the Solo. I believe that that thing I just said right there about Kinberg and Kasdan. I think that's from the Art of Solo book. I didn't footnote that. August 2013, Michael Arndt turns in his outline for episode 7, and then he turns in a rough draft. Then he gets fired 2 months later, October 2013.
Now, Jim, I always thought that Michael Arndt was a guy that was brought in by George Lucas.
He was. He was brought in by George. I think maybe by Kathleen Kennedy.
Okay.
But I don't know. I mean, obviously, George signed off on Arndt.
Yeah, he was coming off of Toy Story 3. He was, at that time, a very, very big name, hot name in screenwriting. So he gets fired October 2013, and that's when Abrams and Kasdan take over, and they turn in their first draft 2 months later, December 13th. And it sounds like there's a world of difference between the last outline that Michael Arndt turned in and what Kasdan and Abrams turned in. Abrams and JJ, or Abrams and Kasdan really essentially rewrote the whole thing.
Yes, and JJ made a comment when this news became public that Michael Arndt was fired and JJ and Kasdan were going to take the pen and start writing. JJ made a comment that they were starting totally from scratch. But that's BS, man. That is total BS. Because Michael Arndt ended up with a screenwriting credit on The Force Awakens, and it's obvious a lot of the ideas that he had drummed up were prior to JJ being brought on board, prior to even the sale of Disney, the sale of Star Wars to Disney.
So really, these are George's ideas.
Yes, for the most part, but on the other side of the coin, we're looking at that January 2013 meeting with George as the straw that broke the camel's back. So obviously big tweaks were being made during the holidays. The 2012 Christmas season was when JJ started to sink his teeth into the story a little bit. And he and Kathleen Kennedy and Michael Arndt, and Bob Iger, according to Iger's book, it was during this period of time when they restructured what the film is going to be and threw away George's story treatment. There were ideas of George's that I believe we end up seeing in the finished film of episode 7. Concepts, but the big picture story was rejected. And so this leads me to believe that after acquiring Lucasfilm, Bob Iger and Kathleen Kennedy gave the green light to George's story treatment, and they earnestly started to develop the story in pre-production.
We have evidence of George's treatment being developed.
Yes. Meeting with guys like Rick Carter and Doug Chang. And you asked the question last week, why did the meeting happen with George and Kathleen Kennedy and J.J. Abrams and Michael Arndt? Why did that meeting even happen?
If George wasn't a factor.
The meeting happened because George was involved following the sale to Disney. George was an active member of the pre-production team. They were using his outlines, his story treatments. They were going forward with the writer he and Kathleen Kennedy had picked. But everything changed. And I am under the impression that everything changed because J.J. Abrams demanded it. That was the only way he was going to jump into Star Wars, was he was not going to be a hired hand to flesh out George's vision.
What about the photos of JJ and George at the coffee shop?
Those were old. Those were way prior to the sale.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay, so those were put out and promoted at the time to kind of give us this feeling that, you know, there was the master and the Padawan working together at the coffee shop breaking down the new Star Wars. That wasn't the case at all.
Yeah, that was an older photo. I think that JJ and Lucas had just the one meeting. And George was blindsided at that meeting. And I think JJ was frosted that all went down.
I can imagine. I mean, George is one of his heroes.
Yes. I think JJ believed he was set up to, be the bad guy in the situation. And I believe that had a big, big effect on JJ returning to do 7 and 8 or 8 and 9.
Yes, that's something something I think that you and I sort of disagree about a little bit, is that I've always believed the rumors that things were very icy between Kathleen Kennedy and J.J. Abrams on the set of Episode 7. There were also rumors that Kathleen Kennedy wanted to get rid of J.J. Abrams during the process of the production of Episode 7. You have said that you're not quite so sure about that, but I'm a firm believer that is not a great relationship, and that it was nothing short of a miracle, and that Kathleen Kennedy had to eat a lot of crow in order to get JJ back for Episode 9.
I think Abrams went ahead and worked very hard on Star Wars, utilizing his bad robot team and shutting out the Lucasfilm team a lot in the process.
We saw a lot of rah-rah Lucasfilm at that Force Awakens premiere. Some of the stuff that made the live stream, it was a lot of Lucasfilm kind of versus Bad Robot. We were hearing rumors about that, and then during the live stream of the premiere, there was just a lot of cheerleading for the Lucasfilm folks.
Right. To make their mark known, Hey, we have fingerprints on this thing too. It's not all just JJ and his team. Right. I mean, there was a Lucasfilm publicist who flat out told you and me, Jason, at Lucasfilm that they were shut out from being on the set.
Couldn't even get a Lucasfilm PR person on the set of Episode 7 when Pablo Hidalgo sort of made his reputation by being on the set of Episode 3 with some of those video, or well, at the time they weren't even videos; they were just these short little, mounted cameras on the set there in Episode 3. Remember those days? You would just kind of log on every once in a while and hope that you would see something in production.
Right. I'm definitely going to see Darth Vader today. No, it's just a bunch of green screen.
So they went from Episode 3 to where Pablo's running around with a webcam all the way to Episode 7, and various people from Lucasfilm couldn't get on set. Yet Kevin Smith could get on set.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Friends of JJ's.
Friends of JJ, right.
So I'm really beginning to think that Bob Iger was not alone in his betrayal of George Lucas. I think that there were concessions made to get J.J. Abrams on board. I think that Abrams was their guy from day one, and when he rejected them, they had a really hard time finding a number 2. So they went back to Abrams, hat in hand, and said, "What do you need? What can we give you to do this film?" And he said, "Give me creative control." And they said, "Well, we're going to do that." And that's how George Lucas was truly betrayed. We have a voicemail from David. David called up the RFR listener line at 708-3201-RFR, and he left us his take on this very topic.
Hi, Jimmy and Jason. This is David from Vancouver, Canada. I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller, and a Patreon member for as long as it's been possible. Hi, Jimmy and Jason. This is David from Vancouver, Canada.
My fault.
I'm I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller, and a Patreon member for as long as it's been possible, a Patreon member. I was just thinking about the Lucas and his first treatments that he had out there. Is it possible that after Iger bought them, that after Disney bought them, that they shopped them around to different directors? Is that possible that's why, like, JJ turned them down the first time and they couldn't find anyone else really for it, and they came back around to JJ after going, well, we can't find anyone to take this, so JJ, do you want to do your own vision? So just wondering if maybe that's a possibility too, and they didn't really want to throw like JJ or anyone else under the bus in this because they want to have the relationship going forward. Anyway, keep up the good work, guys. I really appreciate all the coming every week. So keep it going. Thanks.
Wow, great voicemail, David. Thank you so much. Great to have you in the listening audience. That is a really great theory. Could it have been George's lackluster treatments? That's how they have been portrayed in the press, as being weird and, on the metaphysical level and microbiology, all of this. They haven't really received a whole lot of love, and I don't even know if they've really received a fair treatment or a fair representation in the press since they've sort of been leaked. But could that have been the reason why they couldn't find a director? And finally, J.J. Abrams circled back to him. We know that he was the first one asked. Well, after Spielberg, he was the first one asked. They went around, finally came back around to J.J. Abrams. There was a PR spin that was put out there saying, well, what we did is we asked him the question, well, who is Luke Skywalker? Who really is Luke Skywalker? And J.J. pondered the question and decided that he must be the one to come and direct this film. Is the reality that they went to J.J. and said, hey, if all you need is just to be able to rework this treatment yourself, have at it. Is that the reality?
I am beginning to lean toward that direction. And so, in that case, you don't want to say, well, Bob Iger flat out betrayed George Lucas. Look, there's this J.J. Abrams factor here. But at the end of the day, I think Bob Iger has to take responsibility for that, because it was his call to give J.J. Abrams that sort of creative influence on the entire story, creative control. And,
but wait a minute, Bob's the CEO, So Bob makes the deal with George Lucas. Bob, the CEO of Disney, makes the deal with the CEO of Lucasfilm, the owner of Lucasfilm, not just the CEO, the president and the owner. We're not talking about a publicly traded company here. But at what point does Bob's obligation to George end and guys like Alan Horn's begin?
Well, now see, Alan Horn has a different position at the company. I mean, he sort of oversees strategy for the actual release and all of that stuff. I mean, he runs the studio,
okay, right?
So, I mean, and he answers to Bob Iger, of course. But
right.
I'll tell you, Bob Iger's responsibility to everyone ends the second George Lucas signs on that dotted line.
Right.
Then it's over.
Now he's gone. He's looking at the next thing.
He's working on the Fox acquisition. That's
right.
That's what he does.
Right.
And he left George high and dry in that regard. He did. He really did.
But what about Kathleen Kennedy's role in this? Kathleen Kennedy was hired by George Lucas. She's there at the privilege of George Lucas.
Right. Well, she was the one to break the news.
Uh-huh.
Bob wasn't going to get his hands dirty in that situation.
Right.
But it presented a situation where George Lucas is now getting blindsided.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And yes, a phone call prior to that meeting probably would have been more effective than surprising him like that when he is expecting to sit down and work on the treatments he had been working on for the better part of the last year. So
so there was never, going back to when we talked about that photo of George and JJ at the coffee shop, and that was a photo from prior to all of this. There was never any collaboration between George Lucas and JJ Abrams.
No.
For episode 7.
No. That was just, well, I mean, outside of that one meeting that George walked out of.
Right.
And I think that kind of backed Abrams into a corner a little bit. I think Abrams was put in a position where they went to talk to George to actually get his involvement in what they were working on.
Mm-hmm.
But George looked at the situation and said, I am going to shoot down whatever they presented me and tell them how to do Star Wars. And that sort of reality.
And they said, what? Do you think you invented this?
But see, that sort of reality presents a very awkward situation for all of those involved.
Right.
And Lucas has proven over the decades that he is not very interested in debate when it comes to his ideas and how he wants to execute them.
No.
So he's a smart guy who knows himself pretty well, and he recognized that if he were to stay on board and try to work with this other idea, he would end up fundamentally changing each and every aspect of that idea at any given opportunity. So he said, I'm out. He had no interest in working on the J.J. Iger, Kathleen Kennedy vision for episode 7.
I just had a thought. Do you think George will ever write a book?
Well, yeah. So that's the other thing.
What's George's side of this story?
That's what got me pondering why Iger rushed his memoirs out prior to stepping down from his role as CEO of the Disney company. Because as we talked about last week, I'm pretty sure that when Iger inked this deal and wrote this book, his plan was to retire summer 2019.
Mm-hmm.
So he's got the book deal done. He's got the book done. And all of a sudden the Fox thing pops up and Rupert Murdoch says, if this deal's going to happen, you can't retire in 2019.
That's right.
You have to nurture the assimilation of my company into Disney. You have to be the guy who looks at that and says, oh, well, Iger thinks about it and goes, well, I was really planning on retiring, but with this information, I could easily get another $50 to $100 million in my paycheck by the end of the year. Look up what Bob Iger makes. It's sick. It's disgusting. But that's the type of confidence corporate America puts in these CEOs, and why they make such incredible money is because the board of directors believes in individuals to guide companies. So the board of directors doesn't have to do it.
Right.
They need somebody in there, a figurehead. That's the only way that corporate America survives. And when you have a board of directors running a company without that figurehead, it's rudderless, and you have a lot of infighting and backstabbing. And so that's why they put so much value on having a guy like Bob Iger run a corporation. It's crazy. I mean, but it's how it's all been cultivated. And Iger, I'll tell you this about Bob Iger. I am just amazed at his ability to be in the right place at the right time all the time. I wonder what kind of deal with the devil he made to have that sort of timing, because
Pixar,
it's uncanny.
Marvel,
it's
Lucasfilm,
uncanny.
and Fox.
He goes to Steve Jobs and says, thinking Jobs, no way will Jobs sell Pixar. Jobs sells Pixar. He goes to Lucas. No way is Lucas going to sell his company. He sells the Marvel guy. Avi Arad. Last week I kept talking about the Arad brothers. There's just one. There's just one. It's Avi.
That's why we're not the Marvel podcast.
Yeah,
folks.
we're not the Marvel podcast. I just want to explain that. Nobody called me out on that, but I heard myself mention the Avi Arid brothers twice or some kind of crazy crap. Listening to Iger's book out of sequence,
yes,
I thought there were two brothers, Avi and Ike Arid. Ike is a guy named Ike Perlmutter, who is a big player with the Marvel company.
Yeah,
Ike Perlmutter. And so for some reason, I thought Ike and Avi were brothers because they're both Israeli American businessmen. So it's just something got lost in the trans. Yeah, like I was skipping around those chapters. First, I listened to the Star Wars chapter, then I listened to the chapter after that. Then I listened to the Marvel chapter, then I listened to the Fox chapter, then I listened to the Pixar chapter. I was way out of sequence listening to his audiobook. But, he convinced the Marvel guys, he convinced Lucas, he convinced Jobs, and he convinced Rupert freaking Murdoch to sell these companies that all of these guys nurtured from the ground up, except for Avi Arad, who obviously, slid into Marvel. But all these other guys built it up from the ground up. It's incredible. Somebody told me that, and I didn't hear this in the book, but somebody told me that Bob Iger, if Steve Jobs still lived to this day, Iger probably would have been able to acquire the Apple Corporation from him. Imagine. So, so now that we're at
Steve sat on the board of directors for Disney as well. So
that's right. And Bob sat on the board of directors for Apple.
It's all very inbred.
Oh my God, these corporate guys. So it's chilling. It's inspiring. It's a whole nother world.
Yeah.
When you go through Bob Iger's memoir.
HBO has got to make a movie about this.
I'd love to see it. I would love to see it.